Hello everybody, my name is Gabriel and today I'm going to talk to you about the project manager in localization. The project manager is probably the most misunderstood and undervalued role in our industry, in my opinion. It's also a very ubiquitous role. There's no translation agency that I've ever heard of that operates without a project manager. And what's the key goal of a project manager? The project manager is the person who facilitates everything that needs to happen between a translation request and the translation delivery. So way before you ever had any translation software out there, the project manager was the person who would intermediate. He was the mediator between the requester and the translator, right? They're the person in between. They're the information broker, right? So typically a project manager will get the request. They will produce a quote. They will deliver a quote to the client. The client will approve the quote. The project manager will then allocate whatever verb you prefer on using that job to translators or to the right translator. And the translator will complete the job. The project manager will oversee that timeline, make sure that that's happening in the appropriate time frame, will verify the integrity of the assets that are delivered, make sure that even if they don't speak the language, that the file opens correctly, that tags are good. Maybe they'll run a few verifiers. They'll also assign that task to a reviewer. They're going to get their thoughts, their opinions, and they're going to get the review translation. And ultimately, they're going to deliver that to the end client, right? And I'm oversimplifying. There are many use cases that are going to be a lot more complex. There are use cases where you're going to have several layers of reviewing. There are layers where you're going to use machine translation, where you're going to be working with multimedia, video assets. But the basic kernel of a project manager is an information broker. And first thing that I think a lot of people undervalue and underappreciate is that it's one thing for you to manage a single project. It can seem, well, from what I described, it can seem very simple. But as information stacks up, it becomes exponentially harder to be actually good at your job as a project manager. Why? Because let's say you're going to begin and you're going to have a project, and this project is going to be due maybe in 3 days from now, and you're going to get started on it. As you get started on it, you produce the quote. The quote is approved. Now you're thinking about dispatching. You're trying to dispatch that task, but now you have another quote waiting for you. So you have to stop that dispatch action, and now you have to get ready on quoting. Now, because you're quoting, you're not dispatching. So you're always making the decision between two things that cannot wait. And I'm saying two, but it could be, 20 things. Now you're working on this quote. You finally get that quote out. By the time you're working on dispatch, now you're already maybe a little bit behind schedule. And now you're trying to place this task. And maybe the translator that you had in mind isn't the translator that you wanted to be able to work with. Now you try the second best translator that you had in mind. Maybe they're not available too. Now maybe you have to work with a translator that you didn't want to work with in the first place. Or what do? Do you have to ask for more time in the project? Do you take the risk? Do you run with that translator? So definitely there's a lot of risk assessment going on through a project manager's minds. And I do want to point out that there are many different kinds of project managers. What I'm describing is what I would call the roots project manager, the project manager without any software, the project manager who's doing risk management, quote management, dispatch, all on their own. And that is how project management began. At its inception, project managers were very multidimensional professionals. As the translation industry evolved, most large translation agencies realized that accumulating this many different natured tasks made it very hard for you to manage and scale teams, right? So a lot of companies decided to fragment these tasks and group them together by similarity. So for instance, maybe there are project managers who only work on quoting, project managers who only work on dispatch, project managers who only work on file integrity. That's a way, for instance, to segment and take away a little bit from that stress that I'm describing. But stress is inherent and intrinsic to the task of a project manager because time is such an essential component in localization, and time is never favoring the project manager. The clock is always ticking. Whenever a quote comes in, the clock is ticking. Whenever a job gets approved, the dispatch clock is always ticking. When the job gets placed, the translation evolvement is always ticking. Whenever the translation gets delivered, the QC, the QA clock is ticking. So the clock is always ticking. The project manager is, number one, fundamentally always working against the time. And these aren't times that are across weeks or months. These are times that are often spanning hours, minutes. So the project manager needs to be highly, highly focused on all of these activities of different natures that compete with one another and that have dramatic consequences on the business. A good example is, like, let's say I'm the project manager and I'm working on this really big English into Chinese project. And maybe it's 4 a.m. for me, but in China, where I'm trying to place the task, it's already 4 p.m. It's close of business for them. And I have these 2 hours to place this task. And I woke up very early to try to do this. And if I miss that window, it's going to become very challenging for me to place that task. And maybe at the same time, another project of mine needs attention, and maybe I can't focus on that. And that project is going to begin to snowball, and it's going to become harder and harder by the minute to place that task, because that window where people are available in that particular region of the world also gets minimized. Again, a lot of companies are able to work in and around the sun model, where they separate teams according to time zones and they try to mitigate that. That's fine. But there are a lot of project managers that have to make many things come together in order to try to make all of these different conflictuous ends work. So the project manager is always being pulled in these different directions. They're trying to make things work, and they're always working against the time. And that's in a scenario when actually things are working well. But you have all of the things that go wrong, and they do go wrong because we're talking about humans. And if there's something that we do consistently is making mistakes, at least I do. So for instance, project manager will produce a quote, but they'll forget an important line item. Maybe they'll add a line item that shouldn't be there. Maybe they'll miscalculate something. They'll use a log file from another project to quote, and they're going to make mistakes. And those mistakes may be costly. Maybe they're going to lose credibility. Maybe they're going to lose potentially even an account. Maybe they're just going to lose time and have to redo that. But these are small bummers or big bummers. It depends on the repercussion. And then you start having all kinds of things that go on during the translation project, where translators may agree with a deadline and may not live up to what they agreed to because things happen. Maybe they get sick. Maybe they take another job. Maybe they have to travel. Maybe they have an accident in the family. Things happen. And the project manager is always on their toes trying to figure out how to reaccommodate all of these different situations. Like I said, I can't emphasize this enough. It's a highly stressful position. And as the project evolves, right, and the project manager evolves, what ends up happening is that they end up developing a lot of very intricate relationships with a web of translators that they learn to trust and even love over the years. So most project managers that have a 10-year career record in the industry, you're gonna see they have very strong foundational relationships with certain translators who they really trust. And it's mutual too. So typically those project managers, for instance, they can call someone and they can have another task that's going on. They will prioritize them because they've built this very trusting relationship with those translators. So translators carry these relationships with them. Project managers carry these relationships with them everywhere they go. They have this relational wealth that they build, forged under the fire of pressure of having to deliver against time. The other thing that project managers are incredibly good at is performing risk assessment. Some of them do it in a very analytical way, and they're very clear, and maybe they have methodologies and matrices that they follow to calculate the risks for certain kinds of scenarios. Others are very intuitive about it, less analytical, but they can feel that there's something that is likely to go wrong in this project. They develop almost this sixth sense over what can go wrong. Maybe it's a language that they haven't worked with before. Maybe they know that there are a lot of translators that are good but already busy with other tasks from other project managers in that given project. Maybe they know how high the standards for that given client are. Maybe it's the nature of the text. Maybe it's a marketing text. Maybe it's a pharmaceutical text. Maybe they're very picky about terminology. Maybe it has legal ramifications. But the bottom line is that a project manager, a really good project manager, is aware about all of these little details, both explicit and implicit contexts of what the nature of the relationship is with the given clients, how good that relationship is right now. Is it in rocky terms? Is it in great terms? How big is the tolerance for any kind of mistakes? Who should be the people involved? How are they working? How are their work being received? What's the overall health of the quality in that given language pair or with that given vendor? The project manager is doing such an unbelievable number of different tasks all at the same time. Most project managers are doing a little bit of vendor management, a little bit of quality management, a little bit of risk management, a little bit of client relationship management. They're working on all these different aspects of the translation workday, and they're typically not being seen as the stars that they are. Why? Because project management isn't typically seen as a revenue generating role. Project manager is typically seen as an operational role. An account manager maybe, or a salesperson, they are revenue generating. And we typically have this very Cartesian approach as to what's revenue generating as opposed to what's operational. In my opinion, the whole point of our perspective at BureauWorks around what's revenue and what's operation is that everything is revenue. If you have a very tight operation, and we believe software is very conducive to having a very tight operation, you naturally end up having good revenues. And if you have a very poorly run operation, it's going to be hard to meet those revenues, even if you have an exceptional sales and account management team. But anyway, in our conception, the project manager is instrumental to the revenue of any given translation agency. I would say in most cases, translation agencies will typically see project managers as necessary, as fundamental, but not necessarily as the people who drive in the revenue. They're the people who keep things flowing. Most translation agencies only realize how much they depend on a project manager once they're gone. And the impact when they're gone can often be devastating. Most translation agencies, they rely on project managers as these information keepers because they're doing so many different things, because they're doing risk management, and because they're doing quality management, and because they're doing vendor management, and because they're doing a little bit of relationship management, because they know the intricacies of those accounts, because they have all these things that are memorized, maybe written down in a notepad, maybe written down in a CRM, but not necessarily sedimented into a clearly followable process, right? That's beyond an SOP, right? If something is an SOP, forget it. That's not good enough. Unless something is like really sculpted into software and anybody is going to perform the same thing, or it's really just words on a piece of paper. And most project managers, even if they do a really good job at documenting those words on a piece of paper, it's the same thing, in my opinion. It's analogous of a chef writing down a recipe, right? A Michelin chef could write down a recipe for me. I would turn that Michelin 3-star recipe into disaster. I'm definitely not a good cook. So writing down something and expecting that other people are going to be able to follow that accordingly, there's a huge, huge knowledge gap there, right? So number one, project managers carry this huge level of knowledge around everything. And that knowledge is carried with them when they leave. And a lot of translation agencies, they will deeply realize when they lose a project manager just how much of a hole that's created in the company. The second thing that is gone when the translator project manager leaves is these key relationships with very important translators. Translators are the life and the blood of translations. That's what our industry does. And a lot of project managers over the years, like I mentioned before, they develop these very, very deep, meaningful relationships with translators who learn how to trust them. And often it happens that maybe once a new project manager comes up, maybe those same translators, they don't feel that comfortable anymore taking jobs from this new project manager. Maybe they're not as tactful. Maybe they're not as respectful. Maybe they're not as funny or as witty. And those things matter, right? It's humans talking to humans. The relational match, the relational trust, it's fundamental to driving in good results. Again, that's something that's fundamental and irreplaceable to a translation project manager. There are so many other things that translation project managers carry with them when they leave. They carry all this know-how of processes and best practices and things that need to be done in certain situations in order to avoid certain things from happening. And you only realize that those things were being done after they stopped being done, and now these disastrous things are happening. So it's super, because this is the key thing, right? Because project managers are so fundamental to the translation business, they often go by unnoticed because they become the standard. They are the day-to-day. And a really, really good project manager, they're going to seem invisible. Why? Because these problems are not happening in the first place, right? So if there are no problems to be solved, it's very hard to argue the value that you're generating. You're there, your value is preventing problems from existing, right? It's very different. If you're in sales, for instance, I can show a sale that I brought in. Hey, I brought in this amount of business and there's something to speak for your job. As a project manager, it's like, hey, I prevented any late deliveries. And that's kind of like, well, that's expected. That's your job, right? Your job is to prevent late deliveries. Hey, I prevented any kind of dissatisfaction from my clients. Well, again, that's your job. Hey, I guaranteed a certain profitability margin with my linguist. Again, that's expected, right? Because it's an operational job, everything that you do is expected. But at the same time, you're going to get the hammer if jobs are late, clients are upset, translators are upset, if there are quality issues. That's all going to fall on the project manager. So the project manager, in my opinion, is in this very complex and ungrateful position. All of their mistakes are super visible instantly. And at the same time, all the credit they create goes by unnoticed. In my opinion, that's not just a problem in our industry, that's a problem of most basic operational roles. They go by unnoticed because they are foundational roles. They become a part of what the business is, and they're seldom recognized and rewarded as such. The other thing that happens with project managers is that so many project managers end up evolving into this hero role, right? Because most project managers are working with terrible software or no software at all. Some project managers are working with Excel sheets. Some project managers are using HubSpot, or some project, which is a great CRM, but not meant to, manage translation workflows. Some project managers are working with super dated software. Some project managers are working with software that just takes in their input, but isn't really helping them guide throughout the process. So our vision around our software, BureauWorks, was really to create software that makes this very complex role evolve into a more rewarding and more gratifying role. And our vision is that if some of this complexity gets taken away by software, and I mean some of it, obviously not all of it, some of this complexity gets taken away by software. And let's say, for instance, that you have very predictable things that need to happen in a very mechanical way. If those mechanical things can be taken care of, a project manager can evolve into the role of what we believe to be an true exception management framework. In exception management, instead of worrying, for instance, of placing every single job into Brazilian Portuguese, I only have to worry about those jobs that I flag as, this job that requires an extra set of eyes from me because this is a new account, because this is a new kind of content, because our main translators are all away. Anyway, I can work on an exception management level. I can work on a more strategic level. Instead of just ensuring that the emails are being sent out and that the jobs are being delivered, right? Instead of ensuring just that foundational element, I can start layering on more strategic elements. And as I start layering on more strategic elements, I can show the company that I work for a lot better the value that I help deliver, right? If I'm able to show my managers that I drove our gross profitability from 55% to 60%, for instance, in the last quarter, I'm definitely going to get more than a pat on the back. At least if I have good managers, they should. They should be able to recognize that drives value to the business, as opposed to, for instance, if I'm so tired and so overworked where I can't even promote my own work and promote my own wins and perhaps even see them, because that's just how I feel. I just feel overwhelmed, overworked, overtired, underappreciated, stressed. When I'm in that mindset, it's very hard for me to market my own achievements internally in my company. So the vision for our software is to take care of the mechanical stuff. And there is a lot of mechanical work in project management, whether it's generating a log file, whether it's generating a localization kit, whether it's sending a task to a given translator, whether it's just following up on that task, preparing a quote. You add these tasks, you add these things up, and it's 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, 3 minutes there, and the day will just fly by. If there's something that I've seen with project managers in translation, is that their sense of time is just different than most people. Like, they understand that clock is ticking all the time, right? And the idea of our software is to provide a little bit of a slowdown in that clock, so that if you know the bones are being taken care of, now you can focus on the meat. Now you can focus on the mind. Now you can focus on really trying to create something as opposed to just reacting to things. And that's the beauty of the proposition that I believe really good project management software delivers, right? It's one thing for you to have project management software that will take in your numbers, that will take in your input. The other thing is to have translation software that's going to dialogue with you, that's going to flag certain things for you, that's going to really mechanically drive certain things for you, so that you can use and leverage your knowledge as a project manager to really not just improve your organization, but improve how people see you in the organization. Because above all, I think that project managers, they kind of fall into this role. It's typically a role that accommodates a very specific kind of personal constitution. And when people are in this role, it's such a chaotic role. It's so much pressure that they either leave into another role or they settle into this role. But whatever happens, it's very rare that project managers are able to really evolve in that role into ever more strategic decision-making positions. Obviously, it happens. I mean, for sure, but it's not the path of most. The path of most is to endure. The path of most is to cope. The path of most is to, even I would go as far as saying, suffer, and eventually either move into another role or leave. Sometimes even leave the industry altogether. I've seen dozens of project managers that I've met over the years so disillusioned with the role. So again, I think what I really want to stress is that the project manager is left with what I believe to be maybe the hardest part of localization. They're the people between the text and the translator. And there's so much that happens between the text and the translator. And no matter how good the software is, there's so much intricacy that's left to human subjectivity, that's left to human exception management and intervention. And I think people radically underestimate what that means. So this is my video to just show my utmost respect to project managers, my gratitude, and our belief that it is possible to enhance the human ingenuity and creativity that's behind project managers through our software, BureauWorks. Thank you.